Ooh, look at me going live 10 seconds early. Hey, everybody. Amy with Ask a Christian, and we are finishing up Esther. Ooh, I put my new camera up there, so I have to remember to look up there. We're finishing up Esther tonight, and of course, with me, I have my favorite triathlete, funny person, and cat owner, Chad Reed. This is Chad.
Hello.
He does sometimes comb his hair, but didn't feel like it today. Chad, a commentary on your hairstyle.
I'm still recovering from a vacation weekend. I was on call for the first half of the weekend, so I'm just sort of enjoying the laziness post-weekend. So, yeah, I'm turning up Bruno Mars and not combing my hair or doing really anything.
All right. I want to first, let me just say thanks for joining us. I see you out there. If you feel like introducing yourself, telling us who is online watching along with us, we would love it. And also, we do want to offer the option of whenever you hear Biscuit meowing to give us those cat emojis. We're making Biscuit a thing, and we've already talked about what we're doing next. We'll talk about it at the end and get some of your ideas on what book we want to read through next. But if you have ideas on that, and also how we can reward our viewers for spotting or hearing Biscuit first, we would love to hear what prizes you'd be interested in receiving for those the cat-based awards. So hello and welcome to Sue in Australia. Thank you. Okay, there's Biscuit. And then whoever else is anonymously watching, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have a good time today. We're going to do a little bit of grieving today for the end of this. There's some terrible parts coming up. And we're also going to look for the gospel in Esther today and also themes of good versus evil. So I'm going to open with prayer. I'm going to ask you if you have any prayer requests, both Chad, Sue, whoever else is watching. We want to take a minute and do your prayer request. So I know we've got like a 30-second delay, and I want to give you time to get those in. So while I'm chatting it up with Chad, let me know if there's something we can pray over you about today. Chad, do you have any prayer requests?
It's tough. I struggle with prayer sometimes because sort of everything needs to be prayed about. But then if you pray about everything, then it feels like you're not really asking for anything. So I don't know. There's certainly a lot going on in the world and a lot that I need to trust God to handle. But everything's going okay for me right now.
That's nice. I want to pray specifically for, our church is doing a drive-through grocery share. And so we just keep praying that the right people show up, people that we can minister to, that we can actually help. Like, we're happy to give groceries to anybody, but we want to make sure that they go to the people who are most in need and in our community, because we think that the local church should be community focused. And Sue, I see you. We're going to pray for your marriage. Sounds like you've got a lot going on. I want to pray for another lady I know in a similar situation. Sue, thanks for bringing it up, because you kind of jogged my memory about a lady I met with this week. And then Janet, Janet says, struggling to get a connection. I am guessing you mean internet, but I don't want to assume that. And
that's one of those things where I don't know if she's making a deep philosophical statement or an IT complaint.
I know. So we'll pray for both, Janet, that your internet works and connection with God. Marayi, hello, Marayi. She's in Arkansas. So we've got Australia and California and Arkansas represented here. Yes, we're definitely going to pray for you and your family. Finances are weird for me right now. Pandemic stuff removed a part-time side hustle that I had, and I'm looking for another one. And of course, I want to pray for my relationship. I want to pray for my roommates who are kind of on the front lines of health and wellness. And then, yeah, anything else that you guys put in there. I do see them during the week, and I will be praying over them. So let's just take a minute, open with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, I know that you are with us and that you hear us, and that each one of these prayer requests you take as a heart's cry to get to know you, to walk with you. And I especially want to lift up my friends who had made their prayer requests known and those who have kept silent. God, I want to lift up Sue to you right now and ask that you would intervene in a mighty way in her marriage relationships, in healing, and stopping whatever domestic violence issues she's dealing with. And I want to pray for my other friend that I met in the community who is in a protective home right now, that you would make a way for them to find happiness and healing. I want to pray for Janet. And while I think that this is probably an internet commentary, if it's not, God, I just want to join her in asking also for a deeper connection with you. Father, I want to pray for Madai, who has challenges of her own, who is so in love with her friends and family and wants to be a witness and a warrior for you, that you'd empower her to do that in her own special way. God, I want to pray for Chad and all the things on his heart and his mind. And as he is the kind of guy who seeks to lighten other people's burdens and lift their loads, that you do the same for him. And I'm just checking to make sure you don't have any other requests. But God, you have heard us, and you have put people and situations in our paths that you're already working these things out in. Just like we see in Esther, we don't have to even say or know your name to know that you are working providentially for and with us. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Wild ride tonight. We're going to finish up 9 and basically just a little postscript in chapter 10. And then I want to ask you guys some questions about where you see the gospel, where you see Jesus, where you see Satan, where you see the church in the story of Esther. And I've got pages of notes, so I'm pumped up about it. Chad, I don't know if you've been reading Josephus or not. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. All right, Chad, I'm going to read half of 9, and then I'm going to have you do the other half of 9 and 10, since I don't really want to let you out of reading. Like, that's not my goal tonight. All right, Esther chapter 9. Now, just to recap, you know that Esther has gone before the queen. She has claimed her identity as a Jew, and she's intervening and asking if the king can reverse his decree that all of her people should be put to death. So, chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the king's order came into effect. This was the very day that the enemies of the Jews had planned to overpower them, but the tables were now turned. The Jews overpowered those who hated them. The Jews had gathered in the cities through King Xerxes' provinces to lay hands on those who were seeking their ruin. Not one man was able to stand up against them. Fear made cowards of them all. What's more, all the government officials, satraps, governors, everyone who worked for the king actually helped the Jews because of Mordecai. They were afraid of him. Mordecai by now was a power in the palace. As Mordecai became more and more powerful, his reputation had grown in all the provinces. So the Jews finished off all their enemies with the sword, slaughtering them right and left, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. Whew, this is getting sketchy. In the palace complex with Susa, the Jews massacred 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the arch enemy of the Jews. And then it goes on to list the names of those sons, which I will not attempt to read because it would just be a comedy. Verse 10, but they took no plunder. That day when it was all over, the number of those killed in the palace complex was given to the king. The king told Queen Esther, and the palace complex alone here in Susa, the Jews have killed 500 men plus Haman's 10 sons. Think of the killing that must have been done in the rest of the provinces. What else do you want? Name it and it's yours. Your wish is my command. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I think I sent Chad a WTF message last week as soon as I had read this. Yeah. Struggling through this part of Esther. I wanted it to end like, and even now would be a great ending. What do you think about this? What do you think about the oppressed people, the oppressed Jews, now being able to take matters into your own hands? Is this sweet justice, Chad, or is this like retribution and evil back the other way?
Well, so I had a thought that I wanted to talk about, but I feel like it's a little bit too early. I need the big reveal that happens
after this next section.
Verse 16.
Oh, okay. Well, that's kind of where I was going to read through. So, yeah, let me go ahead and do that, and then I'll let you have the rest in the big reveal. All right. I do like verse 10. It says, but they took no plunder. So I do want to highlight that. And then let's go to verse 13 now. It says, if it please the king, Queen Esther responded, give the Jews of Susa permission to extend the terms of the order another day, and have the bodies of Haman's 10 sons hanged in public display on the gallows. So the king commanded it. The order was extended. The bodies of Haman's 10 sons were publicly hanged. The Jews in Susa went at it again. On the 14th day of Adar, they killed another 300 men in Susa, but again, they took no plunder. Meanwhile, in the rest of the king's provinces, the Jews had organized and defended themselves, freeing themselves from oppression. On the 13th month of Adar, they killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but did not take any plunder. On the next day, the 14th, they took it easy and celebrated with much food and laughter. But in Susa, since the Jews had banded together on both the 13th and 14th days, they made the 15th their holiday for laughing and feasting. This accounts for why Jews living out in the country in the rural villages remember the 14th day of Adar for celebration, their day for parties and the exchange of gifts. All right. This does not make it better for me, Chad. You better fill in the blank.
I don't know if I'm going to be helpful, but I felt like it was too soon to do to borrow from my comic book friends, the alternate universe. So the chapters 9 and 10, I basically feel are that part that they sneak in the based on a true stories movies, where they give you this whole thing that was pretty much made up, and then the credits roll and they say this guy lived to be 75 and had a happy life, and then probably had much more interesting experiences than we detailed in this rom-com. Right. So I want to take a quick side trip to the alternate universe where Mordecai is the bad guy.
Okay.
Because think about how you think, like, this Mordecai has a mustache and has the good fortune of his nephew being called to the palace, or no, not nephew, niece. His niece Esther being called to the palace and being selected to be queen. And so he whispers to her, hey, this is a crazy plan, but I want you to go before the king and say what I tell you to say. And it's a big risk, but it could pay off really well for us in the long run. So she goes to do this. Everyone's wowed. They're like, how on earth could she do this? And she whispers in his ear, that guy's a bad guy. And it doesn't really sound like the king did any research. He was like, oh, okay, you're cute. He's a bad guy. We'll kill him. He's in charge now. And everybody else in the kingdom is afraid of this guy who was just put in charge. And he makes a decree saying, I would like all of my enemies to be killed, 75,000 of them to be exact, in about 7 or 8 months. But he gets to write the story at the end, so he makes himself out to be the good guy. Like it's just bizarre. Like, would we excuse? We look at this story as a story of someone who stepped up and had courage to do the right thing, but in the end, that still sounds like a really big number of people that lost their lives. So did the good guys win?
Are the good guys really good?
Yeah, like if we take a side trip to the alternate universe where Mordecai is evil and tricks the king into killing 75,000 people, like what I don't think the Bible gives us a lot of details here as to whose side I should be on.
Yeah, it was pretty rough for me as well. So here's something I didn't notice in my first read through, which made it better. By the way, I will link an article. Chad, remind me. I will link an article that I read and I sent to Chad with different rabbinical perspectives on this story. Just so you know, there is one perspective that says, while this is not debating the trustworthiness of the Bible. This story is true, but it was written in a way to highlight certain things. So it's like the based on a true story, kind of like you were saying, Chad, where the credits roll and you find it. Like, there were some things tweaked for the Hollywood movie. And part of that history, part of that says that, somebody linked to Mordecai wrote the story, maybe one of his scribes, and did it as a testimony to God because people were noticing, oh my goodness, Haman had it out for the Jews, but look how the tables turned. This God is somebody else. Look how they almost got slaughtered, but the tables turned. This God must be somebody else. And that's why the fear of Mordecai, that's why the fear of the Lord came upon them. And so they're condensing this and they're writing this down, not mentioning the Hebrew God because they don't want people to be too wary. They want them to take the story as it is and be like, okay, now tell me more about this God working behind the scenes. So there's that perspective that says this is only, these are real people, real time, real happening, but based on a true story. Maybe we don't have the numbers right, blah, blah, blah. Then there is the idea that absolutely everything in here is true, but although the Jewish people appear to be bad, you've got to read in the lines. You've got to read inside. And what this is saying, this part that I, just saw after reading it for the third or fourth time, is that the majority of the killing happens in the capital city where Mordecai and Esther live. The second day is just in Susa or just in that area. When he says, imagine what happened in all the provinces, I don't think there should be an exclamation after that, by the way. I don't know that the king said it with that much enthusiasm. That seems like a little bit of interpreting, putting in that exclamation mark. But even be that as it may, if most of the killing happened in Susa, the province where these guys lived, they would have known a long time who their enemies were. Their enemies would have made it clear and plain. Like, they would have been having town hall meetings, dividing up who was going to attack where. They would have, been like, oh, I'm glad the king, signed this because I've been hating on you and wanting your house for the last 5 years anyway. Woohoo! So what that rabbi was saying is that the parts that we don't get here are the parts that would make modern man comfortable. The parts that would say, and because Mordecai knew the inner workings so far as that he even uncovered, a plot for trying to kill the king. Yeah, he knew who his enemies were. He knew who was plotting against them. People had raised their hand and said, yeah, I want to be in the SS, maybe they were wearing the patches. Who knows? But this rabbi says, like, look, they wouldn't have put this in the story if everybody really thought the Jews were being that evil. Anyway, and then of course there's in between, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I can't find. It looks like the decree that says the Jews can defend themselves came out in the 3rd month, and this happened in the 12th month. So that gives 9 months or something to prepare. But it feels like the Bible doesn't give a lot of details, maybe because the details were well known back then. But it feels like there was basically the purge. there was a whole side of people who thought that there were not going to be any laws against them if they took action on this day, even though they knew that these people could defend themselves. So there was a big battle, and the Bible doesn't fill in those details. And we know that this book is in here for a reason. Like, obviously God wanted this book here to teach us something. So you're left with God's justice is God's justice, and it really only makes sense from his eyes, and we don't have the whole picture. We just have to trust that the right thing happened. And I think if you remove God and his justice, then this does become, we really don't know who to side with, because both sides seem to have a lust for taking people's lives.
Yeah. Now, do you think it's to the Jewish nation's credit that they didn't take anybody's stuff when they slaughtered them?
I did, as I was going down this road and going like, okay, are these people taking it too far? I did wonder if they took, like, if they had any financial gain. And I think that is the biggest clue that we have, that they didn't let things get out of control. They didn't say like, okay, I'm just going to take what I want. There is record that the Jews were not in this for the money. Right. I think that's the Bible's way of saying it was self-defense, we promise.
Yeah, I kind of got a feeling of that too. And like, none of us like this. This is not enjoyable by any means. I hate, one of the rabbis I was reading, this totally applies to our time. I mean, this book has wowed me a couple of times in the way that it's responding to our current situations. But what really wowed me is one of these rabbis said, be careful lest the oppressed become the oppressor. Like, there's always a pendulum swing in society when you can tell someone's true character. My mom always says you can tell someone's true character by seeing how they act when they're in power. When you're powerless, when you can't do anything, of course you're meek and mild and woe is me and we care about the oppressed. But what will those same people do when they're in power? And history has shown us time and time again, like what happened after Catholicism persecuted Protestantism. Protestantism became a persecuting power. Thanks, Church of England. As soon as we don't think that you're doing worship the right way, or you're doing God the right way, you're doing whatever the right way, we have this coercive thing inside of us. It is not the power of God responding to people, not the character of God responding to people, that says, no, you're doing it wrong. You must do it our way or else. And that's a sickening thought. And there could have been a little of that in there. I don't want to be the person that said they were all pure, but it does seem to be a defining trait that they're like, hey, we're not getting anything out of this. We're not getting new positions. We're not getting new homes. We are simply seeking justice, because we know if we don't end this, this is generational sin. This has been going on since forever. People have been trying to wipe us out. And now they've made it clear this is basically a just execution.
I also want to point out, because I forgot and took issue with the fact that all of the king's horses and all of the king's men had a fear of Mordecai. Yeah. And I had to remind myself that the Bible uses the word fear differently sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
The Bible says to fear God. So it very well could mean just that they had a deep respect for him, and they recognized that he was the guy in charge. There's like a lowercase f fear in the Bible, like fear your boss. I think it just basically means respect in our modern language.
Yeah. Some of these guys are the same guys who saw him, a year ago, 2 years ago, not bowing down to Haman. They were questioning him. Why don't you do that? What's wrong with you? You're going to get in trouble, right? Now these guys are seeing the vindication of his character. And it's actually something I want to get into a little bit here, but I do want to finish up the reading just so we can have completion. Chad, will you read from chapter 9, verse 20? And then we'll stop if we need to stop.
Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all of the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned to joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration that they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is, the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that day and their descendants and all who joined them without fail observe these 2 days every year, in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, and in every province, in every city. And these days of Purim shall never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent all the letters to all of the Jews in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes. Words of goodwill and assurance to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about this holiday, and it was written down in the records. King Xerxes imposed.
Hold on 1 second. If you're just joining us, we're just finished up Esther chapter 9, and we're about to do a little bit more commentary on that. But just this is a small book. The percentage of this book that is dedicated to making sure people remember, making sure people observe this as a feast and a holiday is kind of surprising to me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it does seem like for such a short book, it's got a really long description. Probably a second only to maybe the Passover. I can't think of another holiday that has this much screen time. I feel like Santa Claus is about to come out and be like, and that was the very first Purim. Now we give gifts and celebrate and eat turkey, and it's great.
Right. Anyway, all right. So the last handful of verses, chapter 10.
King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all of his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him. Are they not written in the book of the records of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all of the Jews.
Oh, yeah. All right, well, we've just made it through our first whole book Bible study reading. Now is the time where I get really excited because this notebook is full of my Esther notes. And here's what I wanted to say about this book. When I first started it, I didn't really know what I was getting into. I had never thought about the theme of Esther beyond kind of what I grew up, having in my lesson study at church as a kid, which is that Esther represents Christ, the mediation of Christ standing before the throne and begging for the life of her people. That's really all I knew. And personal bravery and standing for the right despite persecution. Okay. So, Chad, add to that. What did you think the themes of Esther were as a young person, or, on your first couple of read-throughs?
Okay, well, yeah, I think I've had this moment a lot as I read the Bible. It's kind of like when you go back and watch a movie that you watched as a kid, and when you were a kid, all you remember were the slapstick parts where people got hit in the face with a board. But as an adult, you're like, oh, this is about communism. This is crazy. and I have the same feeling with Bible stories.
You talking about Watership Down, by the way?
No, I think I'm thinking of some Charlie Chaplin movie that I don't know the name of. But
a rabbit cartoon.
Yeah, so the same thing happens with Bible stories. When we're kids and even teens will read these stories and we'll just sort of take them at face value. Here's this story. Isn't this cool? God works great for all things. Next story. And So I really, yeah, I mean, when I heard we were going to do a study on Esther, I really, I was like, oh, okay, sure. Yeah, pretty girl goes to the king, even though she's not supposed to. Everybody's saved. Hip, hip, hooray.
Yeah, I know that story.
Biscuit also knows the story.
All right. Well, okay. So, and I want to talk about how that's changed for both of us as we go through. So feel free to jump in. But this in part is preparation. I mean, now it is. I didn't know it was going to be, but this today, reading through notes and studying has become preparation for, I get to preach/teach on the 18th. So like I'm getting into this knowing that some of these things I want to pull out and bring to my church family. But so to wrap up, I thought the themes of Esther were the hidden providence of God, personal courage in times of distress, and then ultimately what I think after today is that the main story Esther is telling is the eventual triumph of good over evil. And our denomination calls that, Chad and my denomination calls that the great controversy, the controversy between good and evil that started way back in heaven and made its way to this earth. So now that's what I think Esther is about. And because I used to think that Esther was a type of Christ, I didn't see all of the things that I now see. So let me tell you, oh, hi, Biscuit. My views have changed a little bit. I now see Esther as a type of church, a type of the church, Old Testament church. And for those of you watching now or who will be watching later, I want to pause and just ask you, does this make sense to you? Have you ever heard that a woman can be a type or a shadow of God's church, of God's people? Chad, you've heard that. You've bet you grew up listening to Bible prophecy stuff or that kind of thing. Right?
So, well, first I'll say that like my new perspectives on this book is, so this went from a Disney princess story of Esther to now I think more closer to Shakespeare, right? So I don't really like Shakespeare, but what I do like about Shakespeare are...
Don't say that after you say something about the Bible being like it.
Well, so when Shakespeare tells his stories, they're pretty straightforward. Like, Romeo and Juliet, guy meets girl, they fall in love, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting part of Shakespeare are his background characters, which is the the parallel I'm making here. I think that the background characters in this story are far more interesting. The king and sort of his journey with maybe listening to the wrong people or making decisions when drunk. Like just these big decisions and he's in charge of a nation. So he's kind of an example of what not to do as a leader, which is party all the time and keep bad friends. And,
yes.
and
that's actually a big commentary from Herodotus, is that he continually had bad advisors. What would he have done better had he had good advisors? So I'm with you.
And then Haman, and just I think probably favorite character, Haman's wife. This is like one sentence of this woman I do not understand at all. And
why don't you have him hanged?
Yeah. And then Mordecai and his journey with what he went through his closet and what he wears that day, and just there's a lot of the eunuch guy who's like, oh, look at those gallows over there. Like all these just side characters are just, I think there's a lot that we can learn from them.
No, you're so right. I'm a fan of Haman's wife as the world's worst villain. Like the one-liner that got everybody in trouble, you know? Like it doesn't say that she was hanged, but she might as well have been if you take away her 10 sons and her husband. Like what's that woman got left? So what a terrible fate she got for her flippant comment. And I wonder how flippant it was. Like it was a real idea, but oh, that's so cute. But did she really think that Haman would be like, yeah, you're right, I should do that? But I want to take you, Chad, through some of my thought process. And, you know, if you think of things to add in, I want to include you. Okay, so here is why I think the story's in the Bible. I think it is a very clear picture of this struggle of good versus evil, and these characters are fantastic. The reason why I think that Esther is a type of the church is because I think that this book is prophetic. I do think that it was at least somewhat historical, and I do think it has personal application. But I think why this book is called the Book of Esther instead of the Book of Mordecai is because it is a book about God's people, his church. So just to make the case for why I think Esther is a type of church, this is not new in the Bible at all. Ephesians 5:25 through 27 is a New Testament passage that talks about Christ looking for himself a pure bride, a bride without blemish. And we see that although we're not sure why Vashti disobeyed, we are comparing a disobedient woman or a disobedient church to the bride that Christ desires, which is a pure, obedient church. So the prophet Jeremiah also refers to God's people as the daughter of Zion, and likens her to a comely or beautiful woman, talking about character, not necessarily appearance. Also, Hosea, another prophet, is told to marry this prostitute named Gomer, because that's how God is telling his church, his people, that although you break our covenant time and time again, I'm going to be faithful. So this woman as God's people is not a new thing. I'm not making it up. And we know that God's people now is the church, that the Jewish nation had been brought along to be God's special people. But when they rejected Christ at the stoning of Stephen, and other people took up the banner of Christianity, that they became Christ's bride. All right, so that's why I believe that Esther is a type of the church, and that I'm going to save the king till last because I've got some questions on that. But if that's the case, if this story is about Christ's bride, his church, then we're going to get a lot of info about how he wants us to act under times of duress and how he wants his people to reveal their character at a certain time. And it just gets really cool. Here's some other examples. Esther was adopted. We are adopted, as Christ Church Romans 8:15 talks about the spirit of adoption for believers. Esther also prepared to be a bride by using oil of myrrh and other treatments. Oil, we know in the Bible, is a symbol of the Holy Spirit, being drenched and prepared with the Holy Spirit. Esther intercedes on behalf of those who will be lost. This one is crazy to me. If Esther and her people are under a death decree, like we are under the death decree for sin, if Esther represents the church, then it is the church who stands and intercedes for those who are lost. That's a huge lesson for me. I was like, okay, I can see that. There's also this really blew my mind. There's also a woman in Revelation 12, chapter 12, verse 17, who is under a death decree. It's this woman has to flee into the wilderness to have an identity for a time. In fact, this time comes up again and again in Bible prophecy. I'm not going to talk about it now because we could get way too far into numbers, but I will say that prophetic time period that the woman or the church is in the wilderness or in hiding or hiding her identity is the same amount of time until this whole shindig goes down, because this starts happening in the 3rd year of King Xerxes' reign. So that's for you Bible scholars, you Bible prophecy scholars. You can check into that. It's a little too deep for here and now. In this story, also, Biscuit is being way too cute for words. Mordecai then is a type of Christ, born of Jewish descent, adopting the fatherless, guiding and if you go to chapter 2, verse 11, you see that he is walking about the courtyard, coming down to where Esther is in order to inquire about her, to check in on her, to wonder after her health. And he uncovers an assassination plot of one closest to the king. Now, this, over almost everything else in this book, gave me an aha, because we read about a war that happened in heaven where Satan, or Lucifer, as we believe his name was in the beginning, has a plot to assassinate the character of God. He has told the first lies that God is unfair, and he intends to, as we read in Isaiah, ascend higher and higher with his ambition. And Mordecai uncovers that plot. He will not worship for money or power, just like we see Jesus refusing to bow down before Satan and the temptation of Christ. He identified himself with lost and cursed people. He delivered his people and brought peace to the nation. He became great in the king's house and was deemed worthy, like Revelation 5 says about Christ. And even his clothes, which, Chad, you mentioned loving, blue and white. If you remember back in Exodus, the priestly garments, the robe that the ephod hung on was supposed to be blue, and white represents purity in Exodus 28. So, like, as I'm going through this, I'm finding thing after thing after thing that is convincing me that more than just a story meant to entertain, which I believe this was as well, there's a deeper message to this book.
So I was over here with rusty gears turning in my head, trying to figure out when to jump in and go, I completely disagree.
Do it.
because when we normally see a woman as a church, it's usually in a marriage relationship. And Esther, the story of Esther, I just cannot see the king as a Christ-like figure. I don't see this drunk partier who listens to bad advice as, and Esther is not necessarily being obedient here either. She is charging against the law, charging into the room and raising a ruckus. So, but when you said that Mordecai was the Christ-like figure, that flipped. That I was like, okay, I can see that. Mordecai, this guy who is in conflict with your bad guy, your satanic figure, who's saying everyone must give me glory, and Mordecai is going, I can't give you glory. It's not how this works. And then Haman says, well, fine, I'm going to destroy all your people. And then Christ goes to the church and says, you are my representative right now. You are the only one who can help. And so here is your one-liner that seals the deal. Church, do not think that you are alone in this, for if you remain silent at this time that God has called you, well, relief and deliverance for my people will come from another place, but you and your family will perish. And who knows but that God would have put you into this place for such a time as this.
Yeah, no,
I changed a few words to make it fit, but no, it still fits.
Perfect. And I want to agree with you on Xerxes, right? I think had he been a good king, had he been a king of character that wasn't wildly, and for a pagan king, he was pretty all right. Like, he was much more sympathetic than his, I guess, what's his name? Cambyses, and then the pseudo whatever his name is, who came between what's his name? Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great was truly great. And then he had these couple other guys that were not so great. And then Xerxes comes to power after beating out his older brother, by the way, which I didn't know about. Yeah, he's a pretty okay guy for a pagan king. Like, he's just acting like a good old boy for most of the time and doing what kings did back then. So, yeah, to equate him with, the bride of Christ, there's some things that don't match up here. And I think that's because humanity doesn't match up with the perfect story, right? So when we're talking about types, it's not fully satisfying. I wish it were. But here's what I think about Xerxes. I go back and forth with this, and that's why I saved him until later. And then I want to get to Haman, which we have like 10 minutes left, so I better get with it. But Xerxes, to me, most of the time represents the world. Xerxes doesn't represent a Christ-like figure most of the time. Sometimes he has the power and the authority of the throne, so that seems like God, the Father, or Christ. But for most of the time, Xerxes seems like the everyman, the Grecian everyman, the Persian everyman, who's just kind of going wherever the ethers of public opinion go. And that's also appropriate for our time, right? But I won't spend much time on him because I want to get to Haman and a particular thing that I've been perseverating on. Now, Haman, identified early on as an Agagite, descendant of Agag, one of the kings that King Saul was supposed to destroy, but he's like, he's a pretty all right guy. I'll let him live. And now here is the results of not following after God fully, is that he's coming back to haunt his people. The key about Haman, he is ambitious for the crown. We see that in chapter 6 when he's talking about, what does the king do for the guy he really likes? Puts him on a robe and a donkey and gives him the crown and walks him through the streets. Like, he is desirous for the king's crown. He is high up in power and close to the king for a time. He is devising evil because of his pride. He fully admits that to his wife, like, hey, I've got all of this, but I cannot be happy because this one guy is sticking in my craw. And where does the evil come from? Why is he not satisfied? Because he cannot get the worship of everybody. He He wants to ascend higher and higher. He's ambitious and he is desiring of worship. And he can't get that from Mordecai. And if this is a small version of the great controversy, then the real reason why Mordecai could not bow is because he is representative of Christ. And Christ cannot, as part of the team of creating, he could not bow to the created. But in real life, we don't actually know exactly why.
Well, but this exact same situation happens in the desert with Jesus and Satan. Satan is saying, you look, yeah. It's been a good run. It's been pretty crazy. Obviously, you spent 30 years in this horrible place. Just bow and it's all done. Like, I will let it go. You win, whatever, we're done.
Yes. Now, Chad, this takes me back to like one of our first discussions about this. And if this is truly about the great controversy, then I feel so much better about life. Because remember how we talked about how like Haman's irritation at one man, where did that come from? How could it be so wild? Like, where did that originate? And why couldn't he just be happy with all the greatness he had? These are the same questions the Bible asks about Lucifer. How art thou fallen, Lucifer, son of the morning? Knowing that this guy was like right at the throne of God, having access to all happiness, all purity, all worship of the one true God. Like his place, no, he wasn't just trying to get to heaven. Like he had already made it. How could this happen? Like pride. Pride is the answer. Pride will not let you be satisfied. Worship or homage to anyone else. So not that this answers any of the questions in a meta sense, but it makes me feel like, oh, okay, well, he's just crazy with ambition and pride because he was being fueled by the father of ambition and pride. So at least it gives me a point of origin for him. Now, okay, like we might go over because we have 8 minutes and I know you're going to have stuff to say about this, but here's the part that I have been thinking on for the last 5 weeks. Why did Esther invite Haman to dinner when she's about to expose him? I have been obsessing about that and I feel like I might have gotten a little bit of clarity today. So do you mind going back to chapter 7 for a few minutes and walking through that story with me?
Okay.
I'm switching now from the Message paraphrase to the New King James Version. Okay. So just a refresher, the king and Haman are dining at their second banquet. And the king asks Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. Like, seeing this as the church, the king is saying, now this is where, like, he goes back to being the heavenly father to me, where he's not being Xerxes, the everyman, he's being Xerxes, representative of God's throne. This makes me think it's saying, church, what is it that you need? You know I'm going to give you whatever you ask for. Why are you not asking? And then Esther goes into explaining about the plight that she and her people in. And here's a part that gets really cool for me. Esther is linking herself. She is taking on both the identity as, like, she's taking her identity on, but she's not separating herself from the people. And this is what I get pumped up about the church. Is there a message for us here? Because a lot of times we'll like take on the identity of Christ and we think that that should separate us from the people. But that's not so. That doesn't seem to be what the church is called to do. That salvation comes for her when she identifies herself with those people. And that this is a part where, like, all right, I guess you go back to being Xerxes, king of every man. No, maybe not. This is okay. This is the part I want to talk with you. So the king says, who is he and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Okay, here's where I lost my marbles, Chad. in the real spiritual battle, God knows who Satan is. God knows who Satan is. But do the worldly rulers know who he is? Is this God the Father asking? I think not. I feel like this is Xerxes, the worldly people saying, who is he? I have no idea of who Satan is. I don't know where evil, sin, self, and selfishness comes from. Who is he? Expose him. And Esther, in her identity as the church, because of the purity, because of standing with them, can finally say, like, it is the adversary. And the word there is the same word as Satan, the Satan, the adversary. Here's who it is. By the church taking on her identity, by us taking on who we are, we finally expose to the world who Satan is. What do you think about that? Does that even make sense?
Sort of. I don't. This one is not as clean, I think, of an allegory because.
Of course, because Xerxes is not a good dude all the time.
Well, yeah, and also Esther, the church is trying to petition for people to be saved, and it gets blurry because is her, if she is the church, then her goal is to save, not necessarily to bring down the adversary. Like,
right.
Yeah. And if it was truly, if Xerxes was truly the everyman, then like Esther would be trying to save him, right? Like, sure.
So in my mind is kind of like what we call, some things we call the investigative judgment. It's when God asked Adam and Eve in the garden, where are you guys? As if he can't see. Or he asks, like, how many, how many of you are righteous? As if he can't see. Like, I feel like this is a rhetorical question. Who is he? Now, like in the real story, the king didn't really know. But in the allegorical story, the king is asking rhetorically because he is giving the church a chance to step forward, claim their identity, and thus, not on purpose, and thus expose the devil. And that's where I think he had to come to dinner.
How about this? Because we did talk about this a little bit as to like why Haman has to have his garden walk, right? Yeah. Or not the king. Why does the king have to have his garden walk? Right. In a way, Esther, through letting the king know the true character of his right-hand man, is saving the king, right? To the king at that moment, Haman is his trusted advisor, his right-hand man, has been helping him make every decision, has been leading how he rules the country or the world. And the church in this moment has one chance to reveal the true character of this trusted friend. This trusted friend is a nutcase who is trying to do all of this damage to your kingdom behind your back, and is not your friend, and he is leading you down that dark path.
You would like to wear your crown.
Yeah, he wants to wear the crown.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's wild. I mean, that's why I wanted to talk about this, even though it's not fully fleshed out, is because I think there's something there, and it's making way more sense to me now. Just to go through this in the last couple of minutes.
Did we lose you? Uh-oh. Hello?
Hey, my live stream feed just went down for a second, so
Yeah, it was a super dramatic moment. You were looking off to the side, and I was like, okay.
Bigger.
Do I have to close? I don't know what to say. I don't have my line.
Sorry. Anyway, just to wrap up the story here, I was reading one commentator who brings the spectators back in, like we were talking about. This exposure is now kind of seeming to me like a courtroom scene where justice is meted out. Is that the word? Meted out? Where the king goes to the garden to determine, like, and it needed to be in front of witnesses. It needed to be with some of the servants around, which commentators say might represent angels. Because when you make a decision of judgment, to do that on your own itself invites judgment. And so when I look at this about good versus evil, thinking about in heaven, God could have easily, with his power, destroyed Lucifer right away as soon as he knew that he was, an assassinator of character. He could have done that, but it wouldn't have brought peace to the kingdom, because everyone would have wondered eternally, like, oh, don't go against the king or you'll end up squashed like Lucifer, right? And in this situation, it makes me think, like, okay, this is why Harbona is here saying, oh, look, there's some gallows, right? Because then the king is not making judgment by himself. And the Bible does say that the saints will share in the judgment of the wicked. We will be saying whether or not the king is righteous and just in doing what he did to wipe out sin. So if, and then, like, you get to see what happens. Mordecai is not only, restored, but elevated. He is back in with the king. They're united force. He gets a signet ring. And then it talks about this. Here's the last thing I'll say. And then, Chad, your final thoughts. Chapter 8, verse 15. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. And then I was going to read one more. Oh, and then 17. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Just an interesting, like, Christ being lifted up and drawing all men. Mordecai, is found to be righteous and good, and he's united with the king, and because of it, there's peace and joy in all the land. So back to the fairy tale ending, but very similar to what we believe heaven will be like. Besides the destroying of the tormentors, which is hard for any heart to take, like, we wish that everybody would repent. We wish that everybody would come to the knowledge, that we believe we have, and that, wouldn't be anything except in love with other humans and have this other-centeredness. But, unfortunately, that doesn't seem like the case. So anyway, Chad, the last couple of minutes are yours, your reflections, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think when we started this, I was excited to look at this story in a different way, and we took some crazy turns and we met some interesting people. And what started as I started thinking, like, this story is crazy. I don't even know if it could be real. And then that craziness, when we looked at it long enough, became a really good allegory. The king is us, basically. Esther is the church, Mordecai is a Christ-like figure, and then all of the Jews are Christ's people that we are trying to save in everything, and even all of the people that lost their lives during the purge is just Judgment Day, basically. It is people meeting their just end, and while it does seem tragic and it does seem awful, what we really have to focus on is, because of God's plan, it could have been so much worse. Like, we do not know what the toll would have been had there not been a plan to save God's people. And it turns into like a really beautiful allegory, and it turns into like a holiday to be celebrated, that good triumphs over evil, that there is a plan to save, that there is a plan to bring down the prideful and dispense like that what needs to happen will happen, and that God has everything in control. And I think, I'm excited where we wound up.
Me too. The only thing I'm worried about is not becoming Haman at this point.
Yeah.
Like, what's our safeguard? How do we not let pride destroy us? When I read in the Bible, it's, there's tons of things that we can do to be rebellious against God, but it seems like the thing that you don't recover from is pride. Out of all the things, like, God would rather have an adulteress, a murderer, whatever. All these people will find it way easier to get into the kingdom of God than those who have a prideful heart. God just can't reach us. And that kind of ended up being my shoot, like, how do I not become Haman?
Yeah.
Well, Chad, thanks for joining me on this journey, and all those of you who are following along, sitting along with us. Love to hear your comments about this, things that you see that that go along with this good versus evil allegory, things that you think don't add up. And by the way, I do think there are several that just, they don't quite go. Like, the king had a bunch of brides, concubines anyway, so that throws it off at the beginning. But I think overall, like, there's a bigger story here than I thought. And also, Chad and I have talked about doing another book after a summer break, and we would love to have your ideas. What do you want to study? What's of your interest? Because if you're going to join us, you've got our ear. And if you just want Chad to do it on your own, you can tell him. If you don't like him, you can tell me. We will not be offended. But thanks for joining along with us, and we'll take your suggestions. We'll end the broadcast for now. Just know that we're praying for you and with you, and we'll read your comments. And I'm wishing you joy and peace for your journey wherever it leads you. Thanks for joining me. Ask a Christian.